Excited to be here with Triple Pundit today. I'm Celia Willett. I am the CEO of the Responsible Business Initiative for Justice. We're an international organization that works with companies to champion fairness and equality across systems of justice. I'm here with Conroy Boxhill from Porta Novelli, and Ashish Prashar from Publicis Sapient, and Jeff Korzenik from Fifth Third Bank. This morning in an interview, I was asked if in the work that we do with businesses, we find that there are activists and campaigners within businesses, and the answer is yes. And you're looking at three of them, and I'm hoping that today's event is going to give you a real breadth of perspectives on particularly the criminal justice system in America, and different perspectives, and hopefully inspire you. I've got Mary's questions in front of me, so I'm just going to kick us off and begin to go through some of them. The Black Lives Matter movement started in 2013 after George Zimmerman was acquitted of murder for 17-year-old Trayvon Martin, and it's moved into an action to demand justice for other tragic murders in the years since. But somehow this moment does feel different, and it feels a little different from those that have come before. Ash, would you start us off? I'd love to start with you here. And I know we've spoken about this a ton, but why do you think this moment feels so different from those that have come before it?
Right. Thank you, Celia. I want to take one step back also. I think momentum for this moment weirdly started with the pandemic. Right?
Yeah.
I think for the first time, a lot of people, at least before George Floyd's murder, there were stories running about conditions that Black people were being kept in prisons during the pandemic and not getting healthcare and stuff like that. And I'm speaking just for the US here, obviously. And then obviously with the assassination of George Floyd, I mean, the brutal murders of Rashad Brooks and obviously Breonna Taylor, names we shouldn't forget, and also countless since those actions. We have people risking their lives every day in this pandemic to actively protest for justice, not just for those murders, but also justice for the Black community in the United States. And the reason it's different to me is, BLM, the one that started 7 years ago, as you mentioned, that it was only a month ago, the anniversary by Alicia Garza and so many other amazing women, was started by women. And it made room for feminists. It made room for the LGBTQI community, which, by the way, some of the biggest marches I've been to in New York have been about Black trans rights. And they've been some of the most exceptionally packed marches across the United States. It's collaborated with international movements. Look at the protests that appeared in London, Berlin, Paris. Paris is one of the biggest ones in Europe. And it's built on the legacies of everything that came before them in, challenging times of the 60s and all the civil rights movements. But it's more intersectional, it's more democratic. And they really believe the struggle for equality and justice will extend from Black people to all of humanity. And that's what's brought this moment, that's what's made this moment even more unique. And they've been met with just violence. If you look at the way that the police have policed it at the beginning, they've been brutal in response, and yet the marches keep getting bigger because it encompasses so many more people. And that's what's helped shape popular discourse. That's why it's changed. That's why you're seeing statues come down. That's why you're seeing piecemeal reforms, but reforms nevertheless still. And that's why you're seeing people rush to figure out how to respond to this at both government, business, and individual level across America. Because, I think, it's not a question of just reform anymore. On every level, the US criminal justice system is an oppressive system that is, I guess you could say, can't be just piecemeal reformed anymore. It has to change the whole system, it has to be ripped up from its root. And we're not interested, and this movement is not interested in those small adjustments that you see Governor Cuomo and everyone else make right now. The whole system needs to be changed, and you cannot free people from under a system that was based on racism and oppression from the very beginning. And before everyone leaves here today, I want everyone to think about, question yourself, which side of history are you going to be on? Which side of history is your business going to be on? We want to see a sea change with this movement, and it isn't going away because we have no distractions. Malcolm X once said sports is the distraction to Black liberation across America. I would apply that to everything right now. We are in a pandemic. People are at home. You can't help but see those images of the way our Black neighbors are treated every day. And who is going to protect those young children? Who's going to protect those old women from the militarized police force that use rubber bullets and tear gas and batons on citizens who are basically doing their lawful the First Amendment of the Constitution, which they're demonstrating peacefully.
And I think, Ash are so much like, so insightful about what you're saying. And I think, the business engagement in this, right? And when we think about on a platform like Triple Pundit and an organization like ours that has, be business in the name of our title, Conroy, I'd love to talk to you a little bit about this. COVID happened, the focus on the S in ESG suddenly shot up. Then George Floyd happened, and it became like justice reform and criminal justice issues, and how communities are kind of the losers of criminal justice problems, went from being something that some businesses, that a cohort of businesses knew about and cared about, to something that all businesses needed to kind of step up and listen to and think about and learn about. So I know you and your team at Porter Novelli do a lot of research into public sentiment around major issues, and including that's been recently on COVID, and now this movement around social and racial justice. Based on your findings, what you're sort of seeing out there, how is the public responding to this moment we're in today, specifically in terms of their expectations of businesses, and does that seem different to what you've seen before?
I mean, it's a great question. Thank you. Here's what I would say: the activism, the fight against systemic racism, it has jumped from the streets to the boardroom. Yes. In a very real way, right? And I'll give you a couple of data points to help support that in terms of some recent research, hot off the presses, so to speak. 64% of Americans say it's no longer acceptable for companies to stay silent on social justice. 54% of Americans, more than half, say that companies who do not talk about social justice issues in their marketing and in their communications are out of touch. So what that tells you about what's happening in our societies, there's a sea change, and we saw the same kind of data in the COVID research and tracker that we did, which is consumers have now a elevated expectations of companies, because sometimes we waver between brands and companies. Companies, they expect, if people work for you, if you make stuff that you sell to people, that you can no longer compartmentalize what you're doing in your boardroom or in your plant or at your facility from what is going on in the outside world. They are one and the same. Your employees are experiencing this. They are feeling this. They are bringing this to work. And so what we see is there's a say-do gap, right? Mm-hmm. Where the expectation is we expect you to do something. And in the wake of George Floyd, there's so many corporations that came out and said, hey, Black Lives Matter. And then people said, awesome, show me your receipts. Let me see the receipts. Show me your leadership team. Show me your board of directors. Can you give me your demographic numbers? And so I think the confluence of expectations from business and activism from consumers are creating this moment that we're in. And that's what we're seeing, Celia.
Yeah, that's so true. Like, it's sort of gone from being, like I said, something that a cohort of businesses were involved in, to every business that sells a thing to a person or wants to hire people to do a job in their company needs to know about this. It's a moment that we as an organization have had to respond to really quickly too. We recognize that one of the biggest kind of barriers between businesses wanting to do good advocacy around this, or wanting to be involved in this and doing good advocacy in this and being helpfully involved in this, is actually just not really understanding a ton about this. And I remember when I saw the sign up numbers for this event and every other event we've done, being into the sort of 100 people, mostly businesses, it feels good to me. It feels good to me that there are businesses, 200 plus of them on this event alone, that want to learn and want to know what good looks like and how to be good advocates, and recognize that being a good advocate sits on a foundation of understanding the issues. And I'd like to turn now to that sort of traditional place that we get a lot of our answers from, and that's the media. And I'm interested in each of you. I'll start with you, Ash, if that's okay, in how narratives are being told and amplified through the media and other leaders. Ash, how do you feel the media has handled reporting of this movement so far? And how can businesses leverage their role as influencers to help shape that conversation in a way that is perhaps more equitable?
Right. I think, for a lot of people who aren't in touch with this, they think it might have disappeared already, this movement. Right. So because, I think of the way the media have covered this, and it's disheartening. I mean, Gil Scott-Heron once said the revolution will not be televised, and he wasn't joking. The coverage of the BLM movement at scale, like every national media outlet covering it, every broadcaster covering it, when it was violent at the beginning, between the violence the police responded with and protesters protecting themselves, it was covered. You only have to move forward to Portland a week ago, where when there was violence between federal officials and protesters, again, instigated by the federal officials, it was covered. Portland protests haven't ended. They're actually the same size as they were last week, but because there's no violence, it's not being covered. It's almost sensationalized with the violence, but they're still continuing. They're still putting pressure on people, and we're still putting pressure on government officials to make changes, but it's not being televised. And if you ask any person in the street who is not involved in this and doesn't consume social media outside of like their normal cable or any other television consumption, they might have thought for a second this is all finished. Mm-hmm. Right? I would argue that the protests have got bigger. You only have to go through social and see in my city in New York and see how huge they've been every weekend here in the city. Last weekend there was a protest of like 40,000 cyclists that shut down bridges and different streets in New York and like held up the FDR, and they've just continued to get bigger. But you wouldn't know that just from the coverage. But anytime there's any engagement with the police that requires violence, it's framed as like riots. And that's really disappointing, because it goes back to that Gil Scott-Heron thing of like, it won't be televised, because they don't want you to know that people are out here making change peacefully, the way, previous generations did, the peaceful nonviolent movement in the 60s and the civil rights movement. People like John Lewis and people like Martin Luther King, they did all that peacefully. Yes, there was violence there was violence, they received violence, but it's still the same premise. We're not going out there and breaking windows and smashing things. We are going there and asking for real systemic change. And the media is, I think, complicit in the framing of those protesters right now.
Conroy, I'd love to stay with you on this question, if that's okay. You work with businesses on developing strategic communications plans. We've talked a little bit about how understanding the issues helps businesses use their platforms and their leverage well. How do you feel that businesses can use their leverage as and their role as influencers to shape this conversation, to kind of right the wrongs, or retell the story, or drive a new narrative in this moment and in this movement?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think one of the things we take clients through all the time is it's much easier to make decisions when you know who you are and you know what you stand for. It's because you don't have to go through a massive filter in order to arrive at decisions. So you got to figure out your purpose, and if this moment has forced you to self-reflect and take out a mirror and look at yourself, okay, take the moment and do the self-reflection and understand, what do you exist to deliver in this world? Not just product and service, but if you did not exist as a company or a brand, would the world be any worse off? What would the world lose without you? So hence, what do you bring to the world, right? What is your purpose, right? And if you know what it is, then how are you living it, right? And that's your behaviors, and those are your actions. And that's where the say-do gap comes in. So when I talk to clients and they tell me, I want to go make a massive donation to an HBCU, I turn them and I say, how's your house? Okay, how's your house, right?
How's that looking?
How's that looking, right? My grandma used to have this saying. She used to say, good old-fashioned Jamaican grandma. She says, Conroy, you don't throw stones when you live in a glass house.
Celia, could I jump in?
Please do.
I just want to. I follow Conroy's point about who you are, because I think that's really very good. And I'm going to reject the label that was assigned to me in the introduction as an activist and a campaigner.
I knew you would, Jeff.
Our work is focused on helping businesses understand that people with criminal records are a great untapped talent pool and making our community safer. So if you look at that mission of serving our customers and making the communities where we operate better, I don't know a better role for a banker. I don't think you have to be an activist or a campaigner. I think that's just part and parcel of what a banker should bring to the role.
Yeah, but I think this connects so closely with what Conroy just said, which is that if a company understands their identity and their value and the voice that they have, and they can speak authentically within that voice, then they're going to add value to this movement. Jeff, I'm going to keep telling you that you're a great activist and campaigner because you have done so much of value for the campaign movement. Whether you plan to or not, you have. And I think that so much of that is because Fifth Third leans into its role as a bank, and you lean into your voice as an economist. And when you speak and explain the case for hiring formerly incarcerated people and helping to break down the barriers to formerly incarcerated people re-entering the workforce, you strip it down to pure economics, and you speak as a representative of a bank, and you say, I'm going to steal all your lines. You say this is a win-win. There's an economic win-win, and it's completely clear to me. And you're authentic when you explain that because that's your role. And I completely agree also with what you said, Conroy. If you haven't done that work to understand this and find your identity in it, then that's step one. That's step one. And there's help out there, whether it's you guys, whether it's us, or whether it's an amazing marriage of the pair of us. Like there's help out there to walk you through that process. Like, we as an organization will literally teach you how to do this well, and we're not alone, and we'll do that well, and we'll do that with partners. And I think that so often when I get on a first phone call with a business, they'll ask me, what's on the menu? Like, what's the menu of things that you're going to ask me to do? And while we'll always kind of give some feedback and have some ideas ready to go to kind of pitch at a business, the best businesses and the businesses that are doing this work well are the ones that have done the work, understand the issues, understand their identity, and they come up with their own menu of things that they think that they can do and they think that they can add to this movement. Ash, I can see you ready to say something, so jump in here.
I think it's the same issue with redoing the criminal justice system. Like, businesses need to look at themselves, and Conroy is right, look at their own house, right? It's the same thing, rip up the root.
Yeah.
You can't just do the menu that you can't just come up there and have a menu and say, I want to do this. If the root is not ripped out and fixed and repaired, and you do it as a core part of your business, you are being performative in whatever measure you take otherwise.
Yeah.
Hiring a black C-suite member is not solving the actual problem of systemic racism in your hiring. It might require you to change your whole talent team and look beyond the current talent pool that you are just accessing. It's when you go through, you need to look at things like, who's getting promotions? Who's been judging those promotions? Like, all those little details, who's been getting pay rises for the same jobs, and the manager that processed that. You need to rip those things out of your business as well, because they're the reputational damage in your business as much as, the statement that you put out. Those individuals that have prevented their black colleagues from raising up via promotions or pay rises over their white colleagues are the problem. That's the systemic problem in your business right now. So they can't just do the lunchbox, take a few items and, pack it off and say, okay, we're going to do these 3 things and we're going to be okay with this. It's going to continue, and everyone's calling it out now in a way they've never called it out before, because, as Conroy said, show me your receipts. They're not no one's going to be patient now. This isn't, and John Lewis said it best, patience is a dirty word.
Yeah.
Let me, if I could focus in on following up one point that good point Ash made, it really starts at the beginning. There's no doubt in my mind that the path to social and racial justice in the United States, terms I don't typically use, but the path to racial and social justice in the United States has to go through the business community, through second chance hiring. If you do not give the 19 million Americans who have a felony conviction on their record, and the 1 in 3 black men in America who have a felony conviction on a record, a chance to rebuild their lives, we will not get there.
Yeah.
I just want to say, though, I will add that, Jeff, I know this is a business audience and I don't want to change the subject for everyone. I think also the path to social justice really reels with ripping up the 13th Amendment, which is designed to enslave people in America. So let's not, businesses play a massive role in giving a second chance to all those individuals. 1/3 of Americans have a criminal record. Completely agree with that, Jeff. And that needs to be solved for by business. But I would want to add that the 13th Amendment was written to give people freedom, but also it also enforces slavery through the way it's written as well. If you have a criminal record, you can be enslaved in the prison system. So that's social and racial justice to me. If that,
I'm gonna stay with hiring for a second, because I feel like, it is a really important piece of this puzzle. And when we talk, this is an event about businesses as advocates, and we're going to talk 90% about the time about that. But I think that businesses as kind of custodians of things that are important in communities means looking at your workforce and being inclusive with your workforce and being ambitious and courageous with changing your workforce. And, we work with businesses from massive multinationals with social impact teams to mom and pop construction facilities in the Midwest. And a lot of those companies that have hired formerly incarcerated people with effortlessly responded to this moment. And the reason why is because they had the Rayshawn or the Jeff or whoever it was on their work floor. They had been listening to this community for years because they had been hiring this community for years, right? So Jeff, as the sentiment shifts in the public, as we're seeing, I reject the notion that these are new ideas. These are old ideas and old problems, but they're being seen in a new light by a new sort of breadth of the public.
They got worse. They did get worse, right? Through the incarceration, the increase in incarceration rates and the disproportionate impact that had, particularly on the Black community in America.
But that's been getting worse since the 70s and hitting an absolute fever pitch in the 90s. In the last few months, I think, these are not new problems. These are old problems that are being properly seen. And we've seen no shortage of businesses kind of looking to step into this conversation, making public statements, changing their avatars, posting that black tile. But what I really want to dive into today, if I can be cheeky and ask for us to do this, is how do we keep these businesses? How do we catalyze this moment and create meaningful, long-lasting change in our society and in our justice systems, along with their influence, which we're talking about and will talk about? I think jobs have an important role to play and can be a really powerful lever. Jeff, this is your space. You do a ton of work in this area, working with other companies to understand that business case for hiring people with criminal histories and removing the stigma around it. Tell us a little bit more about that. Here's your moment. I want you to share this because it's important.
So about 6-7 years ago, we started looking at what was then a primary concern of economists is our low labor force participation rates. Why were so many people sidelined from the workforce? And as we came to understand this, it basically boiled down to three social ills: long-term unemployment, the opioid epidemic, and the incarceration recidivism cycle. And they're all, of course, interrelated. And we came to see that the incarceration recidivism cycle, giving people who have been incarcerated, or even if not incarcerated, bear the burden and obstacles associated with a criminal record, that was actually our best solution to growing our limited workforce. And around the same time, we started stumbling accidentally, at first, and then intentionally later, into business pioneers that had started focusing on this demographic, people with criminal records. And no matter the geography of these companies, no matter their industry, they all came up with the same solution. If you have a process, a risk mitigation process that identifies who's ready to turn their life around, who's ready for employment, and then critically, you not just hire them, but make sure you give them the tools to stay employed. A lot of that may revolve around mentoring or something very concrete like housing or transportation support. You get not just an employee, you actually get an exceptionally engaged and loyal employee. And so there's very much a business case for this. And what we've done at Fifth Third is share this case. We've done panel discussions around the country focused on the business community, trying to share this message. And yes, it's the right thing to do, not to judge people for their worst moment forever. But it is also, and I think critically has to be, for this to work, a very viable business case.
Yeah, I think that's so true. And I want to just mention Jeff educates on this. Our amazing colleagues at Dave's Killer Bread Foundation, which to guys listening to this in America is a fantastic bread brand created. And thanks, Ash. I can see you. Of course, it's got the name and the title, right? And I'm going to make another pun, and it literally has criminal justice reform baked in because it was founded and created by somebody who's formerly incarcerated. But they actually created like a learning and training platform to take businesses from the point of hearing Jeff Kozanek speak or other people speak and thinking, actually, we could hire some formerly incarcerated people in our company. And but gosh, how hard would that be with our insurance and what roles we put them in and how do we screen and look for these people? How do we change our hiring practices in order to capture them and make sure that their resumes land on our desks? And the answer is just literally Google Dave's Killer Bread Foundation and just click on anything on their website and you're going to get started. So I think that second chance hiring can sometimes seem like a great idea and a bit of an insurmountable the practicalities of it can seem quite insurmountable, but they definitely needn't be. There is tons of help out there. It's very readily available. I'm about to move to the kind of audience questions, but Conroy, I just kind of want to finish our little chat here with you. We've been talking a lot about social and racial justice, especially in the USA, but all around the world. We're not just talking about criminal justice, we're talking about, oh gosh, I'm going to say baked in again, inequalities that are baked in to many of our systems, beyond the justice system. Something that in this moment, I think people are very aware of and they're becoming increasingly aware of. I know you guys at Portion of LA have done a lot of research around the kind of ESG lens of this and what that means and its connection to social justice. So based on your findings, what are some of the connections that are kind of top of mind for the public right now? And how can businesses work to address those?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think we're seeing a confluence of events. I think the reality is most people are waking up and saying the system doesn't work for a lot of people. And we're seeing the interconnectivity of how that works. So we've got a massive global pandemic. It shuts down the economy for a while. The communities most impacted by it are brown and black communities, right? So it shines a light on that. And then the economy has left, upwards of 40 million people unemployed. And so, look at who's sitting in the unemployment line. It's disproportionately black and brown people who are part of that 43 million, as they're the folks in the service jobs. They work at hotels, they work in the service industries. That's been significantly impacted. And then you look at who's being killed disproportionately by police brutality. It's black and brown people. So there's a commonality there. And so you've got these confluence of events where it's really hard for the country to not recognize that when you have so many pieces of things showing inequity towards particular communities. And then there's this idea of, well, crap, if that's not working for black and brown people, what other parts of the systems aren't working for other Americans as well? And so there's that reckoning that we see. And because there's that expectation, you ask the question, what can businesses do? Businesses can listen, right? They can listen in different ways. There's an opportunity, they have permission more than any other time. That's what our research says. Our research says consumers will be forgiving of you if you were to acknowledge and say, we maybe didn't have it all right. We didn't have our stuff together. We may have even contributed to systemic racism, unintentionally or otherwise. Consumers don't care about, they actually think it's important for you to make that acknowledgement. It's important. It's an important part of your credibility to say, I know I have a shortcoming here as business. Here's what consumers don't expect from you, to have all the answers. And that's I think the disconnect that businesses have. They assume that with acknowledgement comes like, here are the 10 solutions and here are the 50 things we're doing. Clearly, if you knew the answers, we wouldn't be in this problem to begin with. So perhaps you should listen to consumers and open up the dialogues with communities that are most impacted so that you can get to solutions that are mutually beneficial. Ash, what do you think?
I want to also say, Jeff, I completely agree with the second chance hiring. Like, I love the work you guys have been doing. And also, just to add to that, like, it's a lot of those guys' first chance. They didn't have a first chance of life, you know, like the way that anyone on this, not speak for everyone on the panel, but like a lot of the people watching maybe, or even some people on the panel. I had a first chance and I was incarcerated. But so for me, it was a second chance, but for other people, it is a real first chance. But I agree with Conroy. Like, I think, you know, businesses have an army in their staff too. Like, you know how many people are employed. Like, you can make systemic change to government, especially in the United States, in a way that you can't in a lot of other countries, because it is like a capitalist country, right? And it's also looking both insular and externally, and like, it's choosing who you partner with, who you work with, who your supplier is, who your manufacturer is. And I think of just the prison industrial complex. It isn't an industrial complex without business, right? So the first step is to make your business, and then make sure all your partners, manufacturers, do not work with the industrial complex that is effectively slave labor. This shouldn't be okay in the 21st century, and your businesses can make those changes in just who they use as partners, who makes the credit cards for the banks, or whatever plastic provider does this. Where is that coming from? And making sure that all your network is clean of the prison industrial complex. I mean, there's a great organization called Worth Rises that released a industry map, 41 corporations that have some ties to prison industry labor, right? You should not be working with those people. Like, you should boycott those people and just find other partners, because there is other people who are not using that slave labor, because that's what it really is. And then also, you know, it's about who you invest with, right? Who's if you're a bank, for example, like who you banking? Like, you know, I think of, and this is a bit more radical, and I'm an abolitionist, so I will be openly say that, but like, I have a very extreme position where I don't believe in prisons, and I don't believe in the police force as it exists today, right? Do you bank the police force? And I ask that question fairly because in any other country, if the treatment of a population was the way our police force has treated our neighbors, we would be boycotting that country as businesses. Forget as a country, and then our country might sanction them. But if this happened in Iran, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, any other country that have all been like framed in a certain way, we would boycott them as businesses and then as a country. And businesses often lead the way when they leave those countries, right? So why not boycott the institutions of racism that have been oppressing a community in this very country? And just say, hey, this isn't forever, but unless you change your practices, we are not going to bank you. We are not going to work with you. We're not going to do your pensions. And that's really important. And the businesses have so much power over government instruments that have been used for oppression. And you guys can make a huge difference in moving this movement forward.
Let's sit with this for a minute, because I love this conversation. And
I do have to push back a little bit here, and this is where people, you know, with good intentions can disagree. There are cases. I mean, I can tell you, we, for instance, stopped issuing new credit lines to private prison companies. But you know, in the case of the police specifically, I've had police officers and organizations reach out to me directly because they want to be part of the solution. I know there are great nonprofits out there like Hope for Prisoners in Las Vegas, which work collaboratively with the police and have great success in reentry. So I'm just pushing back against blanket statements. I absolutely agree. Businesses have great power to make change. I like to focus on the building up part, you know, hiring, creating new opportunities for people, because that's something I think we can all as Americans agree.
Let's sit with the thing that we all agree on. And the blanket statement that I'm going to say is that businesses are mega power players at the table. We all agree, whether it's policy reform, whether it's your internal hiring practices, whether it's some combination of this. You know, it's interesting, Ash, you talk about, you know, prison labor. I think a lot of people do know me on this event, but like my background is I was a death penalty defense lawyer before I did this. And I remember driving into a prison in Texas and seeing black men in white jumpsuits bent over in fields. And it's this long entryway into the prison, and rural Texas. And seeing these guys and being with another member of my team and being like, what are they doing? Like, what are they doing hunched over in these fields in this like huge farm? They were picking cotton ash. And I remember feeling sick that I was watching black men unpaid picking cotton in Texas. It did not feel right. But let's turn for a minute to this overarching feeling. I'm going to answer one of the audience questions, which is that we know there's no secret that businesses are mega power players when it comes to creating change systemically, especially at a policy level. It's no secret that the communities who have been most impacted by broken justice systems are those that have had power systematically taken away from them. One of my incredible colleagues who works at another initiative would call this the kind of she calls this like the power balance. She's always looking at the power balance, how we build power at the table. And so great partnerships can be forged between the campaign community and those who have been impacted by the criminal justice system and businesses. And they can really support each other, and they really can be kind of greater than the sum of their parts. I think this is doubly, triply true in this current environment. When we look at policy reform going forward in the post-COVID recovery, those policy initiatives that impact economies are going to be prioritized by lawmakers, by governors, by leaders. So businesses become even more powerful allies. They've always had currency on the table. They have always had heft. The notion of jobs is a concept with bipartisan appeal, but for state governors in America, particularly for leaders right now, this is their lifeblood. Making businesses happy is going to be critical. So I think one of the great questions we've got from the audience is about policy advocacy. And to me, this kind of hits the nail on the head, especially when we look at the US justice system. We're talking about how do we create change? A lot of the answers to those questions lie in policy reform, in change. So how can businesses use their voices to create fairer and more equitable justice systems? And I want to start with you, Conroy, and talk to you, ask you about the kind of tools on the table for businesses in doing this work well. And then I also want to talk to, I'm kind of pointing to you boxes on my screen, but I want to talk about what some of those policy initiatives are. And I think, Jeff, we should talk about tackling barriers to formerly, because formerly incarcerated people re-entering the workforce is the will of businesses to hire, but there's also a room full of tripwires that people have to navigate in order to even get to that point of the resume landing on the table. And Ash, I want to talk about some of those policy reform initiatives that are really looking at changing racial inequity, and some of the extreme punishment that we have in America. So Conroy, that long preamble, let's start with you. Like, what are the tools on the table? How do businesses use their voices well to be campaigners and champions and supporters of advocacy and policy reform?
Yeah, I mean, it starts. I know I keep coming back to this, but if they know their purpose, they know their voice, they know where they stand, then they can have greater direction. Look, outside of your family, the strongest relationship you have is with your employer. It's a deeply personal relationship, even though we act like it's transactional. It is the mechanism that allows us to realize so many other things in our lives. So the ability of business to with their decisions, as you talk about policy, in many instances, businesses that have a progressive mindset and push even internal policies around pay equity, ESG goals that they set for their organizations, like these things all have the ability to collectively, over time, influence things. So when you do that and you do it for your employee population and you lead as business and it creates a more equitable environment for people to work in, you are advocating for that form of justice. Mm-hmm. Externally, so many organizations have public affairs teams because they're dealing with the federal government on various issues. They already have the attention. Business has the attention of government because they need donors.
Yeah.
I'm just going to say it as it is. Okay. They need donors, right? The major donors are not just individuals. They're corporations, and they do it for a reason. So nobody's saying stop advocating for what is important for your business. We're saying, as you're advocating, look back at your purpose and see, might you use your platform that you have and that voice that you have to advocate for something that's truly meaningful for the communities that look to you for leadership, because they're looking to you for how to come back from COVID, for how to deal with racial and systemic racism. Like, they're looking to you. So like, stop being chicken and take the mantle business and like do something about it.
Yeah,
Like,
I think
people expect that of you.
So
I think I love the stop being chicken, but I also, just to stay with you for a second here, Conroy, I also really strongly believe, and tell me if you disagree, that if businesses are apprehensive about engaging in something that they haven't engaged in before, then the risk of inaction is heading past. Right. The risk of
it's more
inaction,
dangerous. It's more dangerous. And again, our research says it. I would invite everyone to go to the website and check it out, plug for Porter. But like, the research says it. Like, inaction is not an option for you.
Yeah.
You just have to figure out where on the spectrum you're going to act. No one expects every company to be Nike. They're Nike because they are authentic to who they are, and they're, they've got their own issues, right? But still, nonetheless, right? They are who they are because they know what they stand for.
Right. And I think before I turn to the other two, we're telling businesses in this webinar, in this learning, we're telling them the risk of inaction is greater than taking action right now. And to make sure that no one has an aneurysm while we're saying this to them, I think, like, to me, to break it down into, what do you do tomorrow? Like, what do you do tomorrow to make sure that you're taking action? I think this kind of is three things to be keeping on the table: learning and understanding the issue, getting as proximate as you can. Like, the kind of get proximate phrase is a little overdone, but get learning, reach out to us if that's where you want to start. And you're going to start making good choices well. Number two, build robust relationships with advocates and campaigners on the ground. We had a call just this morning with a company that really wanted to engage in policy reform, and they just wanted to know, like, what's on the table right now, like what's moving where, like what's happening in the federal government. And like, those answers are really hard for a business to have the bandwidth to juggle that as well as day-to-day work. But advocates and campaigners on the ground, they know exactly who's a nay vote and a yay vote on every bill that's moving. They know what's coming up in 2021. So building those like partnerships with campaigners and activists, again, like literally what we were designed to do, to bridge the gap between the business movement and the campaign movement. So like, that help is out there. And Conroy, you and I are going to say it 100 times, but like, unlocking your assets and being willing to use them, being willing to use the tools that you already have. I was on a panel with JP Morgan recently, and Heather from JP Morgan said, we're the biggest bank in America. We're kind of big deal. We're in rooms. We have relationships. We get to have conversations that we know that activists and campaigners would only dream to have. Shame on us if we don't use those opportunities to advocate for things that are important to their community, to our communities. So I promise I'll come to you both. Let's start, Jeff, with the kind of the re-entry space, and let's talk about some of the policy reform initiatives creative policy reform initiatives that we're seeing that are coming down the pipe, that some businesses are jumping on behind in order to change the landscape for people that are trying to get that first chance, right?
Yeah, well, one of the reasons I think the business community's participation is so important is without their being at the table, a lot of the policies aren't very effectual. And I think it also puts the onus on the nonprofit and advocacy community to listen to the business community. So for years, I've been hearing, for instance, that liability risk, negligent hiring liability. What happens if you hire someone with a criminal record and they do something on the job site? That we should dismiss that because it hardly ever happens. To which my response has always been, I have fire insurance on my house. house that hardly ever catch on fire, but when it does, it can be catastrophic. And that's the same for many of the family-owned businesses. You know, a negligent hiring liability issue can be very costly to those businesses. So it's important that we look at those concerns like that. To that particular concern, things like expungement, where appropriate and consistent with public safety, is a wonderful tool for allowing businesses to just not even take into consideration criminal record because it's not visible. And because it's not visible, it also means that that liability element is gone. Certificates of employability, the specific name varies by state. Those are also workarounds that are defenses against potential negligent hiring liability. Those are all very, very powerful. And then I think that there's a role for government in holding up examples. And this also gets to kind of the role of the press. You know, too often this is hiring someone with a criminal record is positioned as charity, not business. The Commerce Department decades ago started something called the Malcolm Baldrige Award for quality. And businesses, you know, you hold out this brass ring for the business community. There were consultants hired to win the Baldrige Award. Why aren't we creating recognition for businesses that hire people with criminal records and highlighting their examples? So there's a whole host of policies, from holding up exemplars to reducing the risks to businesses. And then I think that will eventually filter back into how we sentence, how we make post-incarceration or in lieu of incarceration, community supervision less burdensome for employment. And then, of course, you had alluded to this before, all the collateral consequences, the restrictions that people face in employment and housing and licensing when they have a criminal record. There are estimated across all the states and municipalities, 44,000 collateral consequences for people who have records. That's a ridiculous, we're making it too hard for people to do the right thing.
Yeah, I think that's so true. You know, I think about the members of our staff here at RBIJ that are formerly incarcerated or have family members that are formerly incarcerated, and they often talk about that kind of literally like a T-junction moment when they could have or could have not gone back to their kind of old life, and making it easier to choose the not old life is something that really benefits communities, right? Because we know that your chances of reoffending without, especially if you do not have a job, are quite high. So what does that literally mean? That means if you have a criminal conviction, you are quite likely, according to the statistics, to reoffend unless you have a job. So businesses tackling that problem literally takes crime out of the community. Right. But I want to touch briefly a little bit on some of the things you said and maybe unpack them a tiny bit. You know, you talked about expungement, and I think this is something that, you know, we understand but isn't completely understood, which is that if you have a criminal record, certain criminal convictions, after a certain period of time, you are entitled to ask for that criminal record to be removed from your record so that you can continue to apply for jobs without the stigma of having a criminal record applied. That process is in many places so difficult to do that that people actually don't take advantage of it even when they could. And so, you know, one of the policy reform areas that we've been working on is what's called clean slate bills, right? So there are these bills, they automate that process. Yes. So when we think about like, what could a business do today? Like, what could a business jump on today? If a business is really resonating with what you're saying, Jeff, and thinks like, this is my identity, like I get the workforce argument, that's what makes sense to me. You know, right now in Michigan, there's a bill pending in the legislature which would automate criminal record expungement in that state. Done. Right? So you could step behind that. There's also business op-eds. There's a big business movement behind this. There was an event last week with 150 businesses speaking out in Michigan about one policy initiative. There's a sign-on letter with a number of businesses and chambers of commerce on it. Like, the menu of things that you can say yes to with very little friction and difficulty is quite long. Right, you can quite quickly get
and there's a macroeconomic argument as well. Harvard Law Review published an article by some scholars at the University of Michigan who looked at the record of people who had their records expunged and looked at their income. Over a 2-year period from expungement forward, the average pickup in income was about 25% for these individuals, right? As an economist and a businessman, I want everyone in the economy to get a 25% raise because we will have a flourishing economy at that point. And when you have so many people who have been touched by the criminal justice system, I mean, this is really meaningful to the economy. Even if you don't have any workers, you're not concerned about negligent hiring liability, as a business and a consumer-oriented economy, you should care about this.
And I love what you said also about, I think ultimately this comes down to things like sentencing practices, right? What I love about businesses that are thinking about re-entry and thinking about re-entry well, are they the businesses that are also understanding that re-entry begins at entry, right? So why have we got so many people in our justice system? Why do 1/3 of adults in America have a criminal record? Why do we have systems like cash bail, which mean that if you're waiting for trial and you can't afford bail, you're going to go to jail? Even if you end up not being guilty, you're going to go to jail. And what happens if you go to jail? You lose your job, you lose your kids, you lose your community. And we have things like a punishment for an unpaid system of fines and fees. So if you owe court debt and you don't pay it, you will lose your driver's license in many states. Anyone who's been to America knows that outside of 1 or 2 cities, not being able to drive to your place of work means you cannot go to work. Yeah. So, I think as we talk more about the social and community aspects of this, Ash, I'm going to kind of finish this question and answer. We'll do a little bit of a lightning fire round at the end, but I want to finish with you. We've talked about some of the more kind of the policy reform that is based in racial justice. I'm thinking about in Ohio right now, there's a juvenile life without parole abolition bill. Ash, you were a young person who went to prison, right? This is something that is close to your heart, that is based in understanding that when we send young people to prison, we are disproportionately sending young people of color to prison. So can you talk to us about some of those policy reform initiatives and trends that we're seeing at a kind of policy level, political level, that address this sort of social and racial equity aspect of the justice system?
Right. I mean, you know why we're here? I mean, the whole system was built on racism. I mean, it goes back to the 13th Amendment clause. And I think, elimination of that clause, which has incarcerated people to be slaves, effectively in today's America, should be one of the biggest things that we lobby to change at a federal level. All businesses across America, what we spend on lobbying, we could smell a small proportion of that to repeal that clause. But Celia, to address your other things like voter rights being restored, like we had it passed in Florida, then the governor passed a poll tax, basically.
Right.
So now you've got your right to vote back, and all, by the way, 68% of Florida voted for it, so it definitely means cross-party. Yet the party in power at the time was like, well, we're not going to let that happen. We're going to make sure that you have to pay a fine to vote again. Whatever happened to serving your time?
Right.
And on that, I think actually what's really important, I think a lot of these things are going to pop up in the next 6 months, is I think Jeff mentioned and you mentioned getting rid of the criminal record. I think we need to pass a bill, which is already being brought together by the Breathe Act and other Black Lives Matter leaders, that make formerly incarcerated people a protected class. Actually go a step further. If you believe that we need a prison system and you believe that rehabilitation is part of that system, they've done their time.
Yeah.
I don't believe in it, period. But the point being that they've done their time, so now make them a protected class so they can move forward. We need to eliminate voter disenfranchisement, like I mentioned before. We need businesses to really repeal and replace the 94 crime bill, because this will continue in an endless cycle while that bill exists and allows our prison system and our justice system to rest and profile and attack our Black neighbors, basically. And just tapping on what Jeff said earlier on, which was yes, a lot of banks aren't working with private prisons. We shouldn't work with any business that actually provides any service to the prison industrial complex, right? I think it's businesses have a choice do we work with that phone provider? Do we work with that? Do we work with those people providing those tools for those prisoners to pick cotton and all that sort of stuff like that? We need to make an active choice, and businesses actually have the power to lobby government to stop those companies doing that. And I think one of the most important things we are going to take advantage of right now is the thing that you introduced this whole question with. We are going to be broke as a government at a federal and local level going into this post-pandemic world, right? Our tax revenues are really low, 40 million people unemployed. I think it's a great moment for business to support this movement out there to make systemic change across the board. Because why are we spending billions of dollars on building new prisons instead of looking for alternatives to incarceration and abolishing that? Why are we locking up our kids? Why are we giving up on our kids? Why are we putting pregnant women in prison? Things like this that no one at any business would disagree with. And we should be asking our government, why are we building these institutions to do those specific things when we should look at cheaper and more effective ways to solve those problems at a societal level rather than building those institutions? A business should be asking, where are my taxes going? You know? And in years to come, we will look back at our actions, and this is the moment to ask in a serious and a serious way, what did we do to move justice in America forward? For all of us as individuals, but also businesses alike, the answer has to be to get involved in the fight with that movement on the streets right now.
It's amazing. We're gonna wrap up here with a lightning fire. Conroy, Jeff, Ash, you are amazing. In a few words, we'll go around the horn on the last question. What do you feel is the single most important thing that businesses can do today to create a fairer and more just world? Jeff, I'm going to start with you.
Okay. Because I believe second chance employment is so central to this issue, I'm going to suggest that businesses that are truly concerned about this visit one of those pioneering companies that are making this work, that are giving people the opportunity to rebuild their life. I can tell you from the experience of other businesses, those visits are transformational.
Yeah, reach out to us or RBIJ if you want a connection to any of them. We'll be happy to help put you in touch. Ash, you're up next, and Conroy, I'm going to finish out today with words from you because they will no doubt be brilliant. So Ash, tell us what that one thing is.
Oh, I mean, it's more than obviously can't be one thing, but I mean, I would basically look, prison is special, has a deep connection to me, right? So I would ask businesses to look at the supply chains, look who they work with, divest from the whole thing, not just private prisons, break the industrial complex that makes slaves in 21st century America of your neighbors. Slavery was supposed to be abolished years ago. We cry in the streets when we see what the Uyghurs are going through in China. And we have problems with human trafficking. Well, we are keeping slaves on our own soil right now, and we should do everything as businesses to make sure we are not complicit in that.
Conroy, I'll finish with you. Tell us what that one thing, if we can boil it down to that businesses can do today to help us make it a fairer and more just system.
Justice is not one thing. Justice is a big word, and it means many different things. So understand where you can contribute, and the way you start that is you start with your own house. Your employees can help you. There are partners out here like Celia's organization and mine and many others who can be of help to you. You do not have to stick your head in the sand. Jeff and team can tell you about what they're doing with putting people back to work. There are resources out here for you. You do not have to go it alone. That is my message to you.
Wholeheartedly endorse that. We're here. Our sleeves are rolled up. We are your friends. We are your allies. Jump in with us, roll up your sleeves. We're at responsiblebusinessinitiative.org. It's been absolutely amazing speaking to you guys today. That's the end of today's webinar, and we really look forward to seeing you soon. Thanks so much.